Good morning. My name is Phil Jackman, and I'm a board member of Dynamo Northeast, and I lead on Cyber North, Dynamo's cybersecurity cluster, supported by Accenture. We have an active and growing cybersecurity sector in the region with over 70 companies supplying services. And when you include the learning sector, professional services, and organizations that have cybersecurity teams to underpin their business operations, cybersecurity is a significant part of the region's capability. So today I'm delighted to introduce the first of our two cybersecurity sessions today, kicking off with a talk from Kane Cutler, Sage UK Principal Security Specialist at Sage, who will tell us how to position the security teams as enablers. Over to you then.
Hi everyone. So I'll just quickly make sure that I can share my screen. Great stuff. Cool. Now hopefully everyone can see that. Now I can't quite see the chat window, so I'm going to assume you all can. Phil, shout up if that's not the case. So thanks. Great stuff. Thanks for the introduction. So just some quick housekeeping before I start. There will be some time for questions at the end, so please post anything in the chat and we'll pick them up then. Just like I said, I'll not see the chat window given the way that I'm sharing this. And apologies if you can hear my dog barking downstairs. It seems typical that somebody's actually just banged on my house door, but we'll ignore that. So just first, I wanted to start, give a bit of an overview about who I am. So like Phil says, Kane Cutler, I'm a Principal Application Security Specialist at Sage. What that is ultimately we work an awful lot in our development life cycles, particularly on the security aspect. And we have a close working relationship with our development teams, as well as our architects. So I've worked in IT for about 10 years or so now, and security related field for about 9. I started off in a IT support and network engineering kind of role, moved into being a security analyst. I've been a security officer, and I've spent a number of years as a consultant before I joined Sage, and that was particularly in the field of pen testing. I did an awful lot of payment card industry work too. I was a QSA and a payment card forensic investigator, which was a very interesting line of work. I'm also a huge bug bounty advocate, be that running programs at the moment, or be that participating in myself. I think that's really an area that's got me interested in web application security, I think, to be honest, a number of years ago, and that's kind of where I really sort of honed a few of my skills and learned. So if anybody's actually interested in them, it's a great space to learn. I guarantee you'll see some pretty fascinating stuff, and there's a great community out there for it. So next, I always like to just throw in something a little bit personal, a bit about me, rather than just to show that I do have some personal interests outside of security and technology. So I'm a husband, father to our 1.5-year-old girl that I was just telling Phil about before, and I'm a huge car and motorbike fan, specifically Japanese cars, and that's anywhere from customizing them to driving them, just absolutely motoring enthusiast man, I guess. The use of the car and bike as a picture, that doesn't represent their importance over my wife and daughter, by the way. It's just to keep it slightly private rather than post pictures of them, I guess. Anyway, so throughout this talk, what I wanted to do is just talk about some of the challenges and misconceptions really that we see, such as information security being seen as a blocker. Ultimately, really what I want to talk about is how collaborating early is really a great start to fixing some of these things. So the reason being is I think this really paves the way for security being seen as an enabler rather than that outdated view of a blocker or the fun police. Really, this is just about some of my ways of thinking based on the experience I've had over the last decade doing a lot of this stuff. Not necessarily where I work now, but it's just over my career in general. And really, in truth, I think the things that I'm going to talk about, that they're not new, they're not groundbreaking, and there's an abundance of reference material out there for further reading, which is great. So if this inspires a few of you to go away and think on the subject a bit more, then happy days. Despite that, though, we still do see some of some of the same problems time and time again. So I just thought it'd be pretty cool to try and talk about some of this in a non-technical and a pretty easygoing way, as you'll see in a minute. So really, if one person goes away with a different perception of security and how we should be working together with different teams, then my work here is done, I suppose. So, like I said, the basis of what I'm going to talk about is just perspective over the years, and you'll probably pick up that my approach over that time and my perspective has absolutely changed with experience. So to start, let's talk about some of the challenges we face. So I think this is a superb quote from the Phoenix Project by Gene Kim. It sums it up perfectly. Just as an aside, actually, I highly recommend anybody reading this book because it's so enjoyable. I'd actually come up with this talk before reading it, but then found some of these great quotes in there that really were quite pertinent to some of the things I wanted to talk about. So, I've rather brazenly chucked them into my presentation. So there's a few in here, but we'll talk about them as we go. So what it's saying is information security is always flashing their badges at people, making urgent demands, regardless of the consequences to the rest of the organization, which is why we don't invite them to many meetings. And the best way to make sure that something doesn't get done is to have them in the room. And as an information security professional, I cannot overstate just how true this actually is. And I've seen this happen time and time again. And what kind of perception does that result in? It's quite simple. Gandalf. So for those Lord of the Rings fans, you'll get this. And I apologize for anybody that hasn't seen it, but ultimately you have our hero Gandalf stood on a narrow bridge blocking this fiery demon from crossing. I'll not go into the backstory, so don't worry. Our fiery demon's about to unleash fury on anything in its path, and poor Gandalf here has to try and stop it. So I suppose this quite aptly represents delivery and engineering teams out to destroy the world. No, it's not all that bad in all fairness. But ultimately it ends with both the demon and Gandalf falling down into a huge canyon. So it's not exactly a great end for either. Now, I know in fairness Gandalf comes back after, but we'll gloss over that bit. So what that actually results in when we get this I suppose gatekeeper approach like Gandalf there is something like this. So what we have there is, our engineering teams, where possible, will just try and avoid engaging with security teams. So yes, some things might get caught by this gatekeeper, but realistically, and things will get around it. So you can see our bollard there, and people have just quite happily drove around. So longer term, this is going to cause problems. So be that functionality redesign, having to retrofit architecture requirements, and worst case scenario, an incident or a breach, which I guarantee you don't want to be part of. And that's speaking from the payment card forensic investigator work that I used to do. It's not a great place to be. And this is really kind of the fundamental thing that I want to kind of try and talk about. So security are generally perceived to be these gatekeepers or an inconvenience. And, I think sometimes this has probably been caused by ourselves to some point. So, it's not blaming anybody, I guess. So this naturally results in engineering wanting to avoid us, which results in security having to be gatekeepers and engineering wanting to avoid us. And you can kind of see where I'm kind of going, that we just end up going around in circles. So I'll start trying to talk about some of the things I've learned and, which I think have made the difference hugely for me, just even in terms of attitude and improving things. So if we think back to our quote again, I do want to offer some clarification before I alienate all my InfoSec peers that do have to be gatekeepers, because it is unfair to say it's not right. The need for this approach is really kind of formulated over time, and it really depends on organization maturity, I think. So you take the example where there's little to zero process, and it's almost like the Wild West. This gatekeeper approach has really kind of allowed for a quick way for people to get a handle on things, and I've seen this welcomed in a lot of places. And that's not in response just to security improvements either. I've seen this kind of approach applied to operational problems, and it does work for a time, but for a very specific problem. I think the problem generally arises is when this process sticks around for too long, and ways of working have definitely moved on in that time from when it first started. So, the original good intentions behind it are definitely lost, and it just becomes a cause for frustration, which, I totally get. And when that happens, this is where, you get the attempts to avoid security, especially in today's more agile environments where speed, as you know, is exceptionally important. And this just further compounds the issue, is that the security team are then left trying to juggle and rein in what's happening rather than actually trying to figure out how to change processes for the better, or to figure out better ways of working. So, hopefully you'll see I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody, because that's, it's not right. It's just ultimately everybody's doing the right thing, just doing it in slightly different ways, which aren't quite aligned now. So what I'm trying to highlight really is that sometimes we just need to take a step back and help each other. So delivery, helping security, make sure that things are built in a secure way. But while security having an absolute responsibility to really understand the need for development teams to work in that way as well. So, so their approach to defining processes, or security's approach to defining processes, really have to be aligned to this. Just on that blame point I mentioned as well, as another really great quote from the Phoenix Project again, and I think it really sums up what I wanted to mention about fostering an open and honest environment. So it's by removing blame, you remove fear. By removing fear, you enable honesty. Honesty enables prevention. I think that's superb. So what some of you might immediately think I'm going to launch into is talking about sanction-driven InfoSec, but I'm not. I mean, it's a good topic. It's a good topic, and it's a topic in itself, I think. But it's not what I'm here to talk about. I think just to quickly say on that point, my personal opinions really, we shouldn't point fingers and blame people, because often things are simple mistakes, and we kind of really need to learn from those things. I think that approach is probably changing as well over time as teams are more embedded into, as security teams are more embedded into what other teams are doing. So anyway, what I wanted to really touch on is sort of how this applies to the scenarios I've just kind of talked about. By this, I mean not blaming each other and applying those common misconceptions without really understanding. So that might be security being blamed for breaking something or slowing down a project, and security countering with they didn't get involved until the last minute, which just turns into that continuous blame loop, almost until you force yourselves out of it, just like that kind of loop we got into before. So simply taking a step back and having an open, honest conversation about problems, and most importantly, really remaining open to constructive criticism, which is probably what you might need to hear. I've done this, and ultimately then to start doing things about it. So things won't change overnight, but you'll generally find a new level of appreciation and understanding of problems. So ultimately you can work together to drive changes that are needed. And this really kind of comes back to what I mentioned in the summary of my talk about fostering that environment of openness and support across the organization. As well, I think it starts to get us on to thinking about how people and their attitude are really important to this kind of approach succeeding. And by this, I mean that, personally, you should really just step back and take stock of where you are. So make sure you're building the right culture and the right team of people that you trust and that have a passion for what they do. And very importantly, ones that are, open to new and creative ideas, because that's what working in these new ways are going to take. I think once you do this and get it right, the rest often starts to follow, because teams and colleagues work with one another. They listen to issues so they can start really moving things forward in a more pragmatic way and moving away from that approach we talked about before. So ultimately, once you've started on this journey, you can then start looking at other ways to improve. That's really what we're trying to talk about here. So it's ultimately just to work with each other and really understand the problems that you both face in your respective teams. So let's quickly look at what happens with that gatekeeper approach in a development life cycle. I know this is quite basic, but it's just to illustrate a point, I think. So you've spent months working on a new project. You're through your design, you build, your test phases, and you're ready to deploy. But then someone from security has has to review before sign off. And that's represented by our badge flashing policeman there on our diagram just at the deploy stage. So you pass your project onto them for a review. You expect just a quick review and a tick in the box almost. And that's, let's pretend everything was perfect. You might still be waiting for a couple of weeks because you don't know what else your security colleague is working on. And this has just landed on the desk. It's unlikely to be as quick as you expect anyway, and ultimately need it to be. So worst case, though, they find a fundamental problem which needs addressing before it goes live, and then you need to throw around some new designs and workflows with architecture. Development teams might need to rework some of their existing codes. New tests might need to be done, and how long this takes then really is completely open-ended and naturally has huge cost implications as well. So there's no wonder, in fairness, that in this kind of scenario, us in InfoSec don't really get invited to meetings. But equally, when you look back, you kind of set up to fail in some ways. So what do we start doing? Well, we start moving security involvement earlier. I was going to try and aim for not using shift security to the left because I think it's thrown around a fair bit. But in all honesty, I found this meme and I thought I'll throw caution to the wind. I'll have a bit of Yoda in here as well. So humor aside, this is fundamentally what needs to happen, and the ownership of doing that can't entirely be the security team because we all have a part to play in this. So I don't want to go too much into DevOps and adding security into these working practices because it's an entire talk in itself. But I just wanted to kind of touch upon it just to in the context of what I'm trying to get across, because what we need to try and do is go from this, where security are knee deep in unicorn rainbow, well, you know what I'm saying, I guess, to something more like this, where we've got a handle on things. So happy days. And what this looks like is a bit more like this. So let's talk about how that early involvement translates into, this basic design, this basic diagram I put up before. So I'll not go into every area. Like I said, it's an entire talk and subject on its own. But if there's absolutely one thing you can do in this, it's involving security right at the very start of a project, like you would any other stakeholder or requirement. And this doesn't, like I said, this doesn't just apply to security. Think about your operational teams as well, because it's quite common to see things passed over to ops at the last minute, and then have a responsibility for managing and running those environments. So even if you don't have the rest figured out, I think that's absolutely fine. But just commit to doing this and involving people early, because once you do that, I think you'll start learning from each other in a really pragmatic kind of way. And going back to that idea of removing blame, I think that kind of fits here too. So you need to kind of accept that things aren't going to be perfect initially, but the earlier everyone's working together means that it allows you to fail quickly. It helps you try new things and then ultimately come up with the right solution to the problem. And then speed will naturally start to improve as well. So I think there's a quick example of why this is quite fundamental. I've been in scenarios where new features were presented to us with a view of going live in a matter of days, and then we've subsequently found a few issues which needed to be addressed before it could. These kind of issues weren't in-depth technical problems, but they did require some re-architecting and some developing of new parts of the application, which naturally delays the project slightly. And these particular issues would absolutely have been found in a threat model session, or just an initial view of the idea or design phase. And all this could have been fixed at that point. So, and that's before a single line of code's being written, rather than at the point where an application is pretty much ready. I know hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I think this is just a really important thing to touch on. So in this case, I think for me, it was quite clear that if we had that involvement earlier, it's far more cost effective as well. So, it would have been resolved on a diagram, which might have been a couple of hours work for a couple of people, and then rather than several days for a development squad. So summarizing this bit, a bit, I think really the ultimate takeaway is, commit to working together and fully accept you're going to hit some bumps in the road. But most importantly, I think you just learn from each other in terms of expectations and what works for you. I think that nicely kind of brings me onto this next bit. So this is my last one, actually. I should have probably agreed a commission because I think I'm selling this book. But anyway, in high-performing environments, organizations, everyone within the team shares a common goal. That's quality, availability, and security aren't the responsibility of individual departments, but part of everyone's job. I think we need to remember that we're all working towards the same thing, and that's building great applications which are fit for purpose in the modern world. And I think this sums it up perfectly. So relating that back to what we've been talking about, this isn't me just trying to say that you should all be fully responsible for security as well as everything else you do, but rather we at least need to start having some knowledge that security considerations need to be made so you can seek the right support and pull in the right people at the right time. And equally, this is also saying that we as security professionals also share the developer and operational responsibilities around quality and availability. We're not perfect either, absolutely. And I guess using a fairly common example, it's pretty pointless building a super secure application if it's far too complex to access and use. That's ultimately just going to affect end users and make them go away. So it's a really fine balance that we need to keep. And this leads me on to one of the final points I was going to cover from my talk summary, and that's risk. I'm not going to talk about risk management and the technical points around various risk assessment methodologies in a security context, but more just rather simplistic observations I think that I've made and experiences I've had. And this is just sometimes in security, you put our blinkers on a little bit to security problems when it comes to risk. And I've been that person, definitely. And equally, I think delivery sometimes have the blinkers on when it comes to security and having to build out features and stuff, unless there's a problem around incidents. And really, I don't want to just be speaking to teams when they've got a big problem or a equally stressful situation, because it's not a great place to be. So what we all really need to do is take everything into consideration. For example, there's a very real business risk to not releasing a specific feature. So if you think about a scenario where customers are anticipating a feature on a given date, this is quite a basic example, but you get the picture, I hope. Then security come in with an issue they say it must be fixed without any real further context. It might be from a pen test report or vulnerability notification, as an example. I used to be a pen tester, like I said, so this isn't anything negative aimed at red team friends. It's just an example. But anyway, not releasing that feature on time might result in a form of reputational damage, loss of customers, or whatever else it relates to. And the last thing teams want when they're working on these deadlines, which are always very tight, is some arbitrary demand from security saying fix this now, which I've seen, and like I said, I've done it before in the past. So really, what the way I think you need to solve this is just by having a chat with the delivery teams. Making sure that this is a really open conversation about both of your respective scenarios. Take a pragmatic view on how you're actually going to fix it. So it might even turn out from the further understanding that you gain, that the risk is actually a lot lower, or it might not even be existing depending on the scenario. So I guess summarizing, understanding security risks in a business context is absolutely fundamental to trying to change some of those earlier perceptions of security and helping teams work with us as well. So we also need to kind of accept that we can't fix everything at once or straight away, especially when you're just starting out on this journey from being a gatekeeper to trying to, be this enabler. And that's not me saying, don't fix a critical risk. Of course not. It's my experience generally showing that, teams are pretty well on board with fixing these straight away when they are a genuine, critical or high risk. And I think genuine is really the key word there. I more mean those issues which, fall down the risk scale where, sensible and appropriate time to fix needs to be applied. I think really what I'm getting at is just learn and understand what is a priority. And everyone will learn something, and longer term teams will be more receptive to having those conversations with security, and they'll be more proactive in engaging with those teams. So I think this really helps security and delivery teams, to be honest, because longer term, all issues can be properly triaged in a similar fashion. And in turn, I'd probably also expect to start seeing security backlog items start to reduce as well, because ultimately security bugs get treated as a normal feature bug and be fixed more as BAU and prioritized in a similar way rather than something completely separate. So I guess the final idea behind this approach is that, ultimately when security then do say no to something or request that some development resources shifted to fixing a security problem, then that it's going to be something very serious, and it's not just that badge flashing approach that we referenced before. I think really that's kind of most of the points I wanted to cover. But I just kind of wanted to end on an analogy, because I think it just helps bring things together, and I love a good analogy, to be honest. So like I said at the start, I'm a big motoring enthusiast. In fairness, I'm not a huge fan of Formula One, but I can sit through a race and enjoy it. One thing that really sticks out in my mind is the absolute perfection of an F1 pit stop. And I'd always knew that a pit stop in F1 was very impressive, but I'd never really given it all that much thought. And a couple of years ago, I think I remember watching Guy Martin on one of his many shows where he trained to be part of the Williams F1 pit crew. And the insight you got to it was absolutely fascinating. If anyone's interested, it's a super thing to watch. So let's kind of make a start at what I'm getting at. So what I've really been talking about throughout is collaboration and involving the right teams early and throughout design, development, and operations. So I'll kind of quickly do a step-by-step of what happens in a Formula One pit stop. So the driver will be flying around the track. They'll get the race order to come into the pits. At this point, the pit crew, usually made up of around 20 odd people, will be on standby, and they'll jump into action, ready for the driver. Each member, has their own role, whether that's wheels on, wheel off, the gunman, the front jack, whatever it might be. So all four wheels get changed. There might be a small tweak to the front wing. There'll be a quick clean of a few parts, and then off and away. It's almost in the blink of an eye as well. And you can probably see what I'm kind of getting at here, but I'll elaborate a bit more. So the team managers and strategists, you could say our product owners, who might be supported by BA and user experience, they'll inform some of the strategy of the race or the product feature direction. Then you've got our architects who, should be part of this strategy as well, but equally they need the involvement and technical understanding of the functional requirements so that, these could be translated into a work and feature or solution. So they'd help steer the race strategy as well as putting together what is needed for the pit stop and ultimately the release of the car or feature. Then we'll have the pit crew, the unsung heroes of an F1 race, as they're often referred to, and it's where races can be won or lost. The pit crew are engineering, developers, operations, security, and any other name that you might have for these teams or any other teams that you'd kind of expect there. So they prepared for the release. They built the code, being tested over and over, much like in pit stop rehearsals. And most importantly, they've done all of this together and from the very start. So each of them know what the other is doing during that pit stop. They've worked with each other to ensure that all the things they need to do can happen in tandem. They've been briefed properly by race management. They've practiced 100,000 times or more. Apparently, this is the amount of time some pit crews have practiced as well. I think that was on a survey of about 10 teams before the 2019 season. So it's pretty incredible. So, and I'm sure they failed a lot too. And I'm sure every time they fail, they subsequently learned something on each of those occasions. So anyway, we'll go back to the pit stop. So the car will come in, hits its marker, wheels off, wheels on, and a moment later, it's back out in the race. So the quickest pit stop, I think, is 1.88 seconds. That's absolutely insane. Now, I'm sure that's it. That's your ultimate perfect scenario. But I think generally teams are somewhere within about half a second of each other in a race. So, there's going to be some slight fluctuation, but on an average day, it's going to be quick. If you think about this in another way, involving everybody at the right time and early is going to speed things up. Pit stops have gotten drastically quicker over the years with all this this collaboration that they have and all this practicing that they do. So, it stands to reason that you can improve efficiency and development processes with the same sort of mentality. And that's ultimately just working together, learning what works and practicing. And then we kind of know what happens when it goes wrong. So the wheels metaphorically and literally come off. So, one person might not have got the message that the car was coming in. One person might have been told late, so they're rushing and make a mistake. One person might not have even been told the race was happening. So he's at home, feet up, catching up on Netflix. And then someone calls to say, oh, hey, by the way, the car's coming in. What are you doing? I know that's a slight exaggeration, but you get my point when you kind of relate that to the scenarios I talked about before. So I think best case, in these scenarios, you've taken a few seconds longer than you should. But ultimately, by that point, it doesn't really matter. You've lost, or you've certainly lost a competitive edge. Your fellow racer or your competitor by that point is hundreds of meters ahead at that point, and they're unlikely to be caught up. And then worse still, you might be out of the race entirely. So not a great place to be. So I thought I'd just finish up and take some advice from Tom Cruise in Jerry Maguire. And that's partly where my talk title came from, in all honesty. I'm not sure why, but it seemed to stick when I started putting it together. So that if you must know, that's why. And it kind of going back to where we started, security being that gatekeeper is really not possible in today's modern world of continuous integration and delivery. What that means is we really need to find out ways to work with delivery teams and delivery teams to help us do it. So if you don't know where to start, simply start by talking about problems and sharing some of those ideas that you have. And I guess most importantly, just get everybody you need involved early on and inputting from that early stage. So ideally, when it comes to release time, everything you need to know is known and all of your security and development and operational requirements are in place, ready to release. I don't really have all the answers. I really don't. But I think everything in here that I've talked about is just based on the level of experience that I've had. And I just thought it'd be quite useful to share, to be honest. And like I mentioned earlier, around DevOps, there's lots more to this topic when you dive into it. And it's probably something I'd quite like to talk on a little bit more and maybe get into some of the more technical aspects too. But I think just start small by understanding and properly working together. Just schedule some meetings in it and talk to your colleagues. I mean, I've done this in places. I call it a charm offensive almost, and just ask for constructive criticism and be really open to it. And things start to improve from there. It breaks down a lot of barriers. Anyway, I think that's what I wanted to finish up on. So pretty happy to carry on conversations with anyone that's interested. Add me on LinkedIn, Twitter. You'll probably teach me something, to be honest. So we can go to some questions.
That's great, Kane. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
That's great. That was really, really useful. And I think there's a perennial problem here, I think, really, in that we've talked about this for quite some time, about IT teams sort of being kept out of the loop, brought in too late, etc., etc. And the takeaway for me from what you've been talking about is really getting to understand the business. How do we, as IT, people who've been brought in as technical people, get to understand the purpose of the business and how we can help in achieving that? Yeah.
No, that's right. I mean, that's ultimately what I was trying to get across. It doesn't just apply to security. It really doesn't. I hope that came across as well.
Yeah.
I know I look at it from a biased point of view, but that's why I wanted to poke fun at its security a little bit too, because we're terrible for it sometimes, and we've probably created a bad name for ourselves on occasion. But that's just through historic things, I think. And I mean, for me, understanding the business, I think it's having clear view from directors, or having clear view from your senior management teams about what the overall aim of the company is. And I think you can get to thinking about things. So Sage is one of our main visions is to become a great SaaS company. And to do that from a security point of view, you really need to apply, these agile working practices to kind of become that. And that's the way I look at it anyway.
Excellent. So a colleague of mine, when I was at North Tyneside Council, actually, I was complaining about how I wasn't getting the traction with that. And she said to me, have you taken them out to lunch? I thought, oh. So, and the point was, get to know these people as people rather than as other
Yeah,
department heads. And, I thought that was invaluable advice.
it's
I
it's
just want to
so
sometimes
true. Go on.
yeah, so it did. It cost me a lot in lunch, but and but it got me wondering whether actually there's a language problem here. Do we talk too technical with our customers, clients?
I think you're probably right, and I think without realizing it, I think that's kind of what I wanted to do with this. So it's supposed to be a bit light-hearted, not really technical, just ways of thinking. I think that's absolutely right. You know, I know I have really in-depth technical conversations with people, but I find the most successful ones are, you know, going on that bit of a charm offensive, and like you said, you know, taking out somebody for lunch, but just simply having a human conversation with somebody. I've actually found more recently, you know, if I'm honest, you know, the current working situation, I think it's forced people to put in more meetings and talk to people. I make a point of putting my video on and just trying to understand what people are doing. And I think it's really got us a bit of one-on-one time with people. And it's also kind of, you get a bit of an insight into somebody's personal life as well, because everyone's at home. So you see behind me, there's the motorbike, there's the daddy's man cave thing. And I think that's always generated a few minutes of discussion at the start of every conversation I've had, and you get to know somebody on a bit of a personal level. And I think that's fundamental. It really
Indeed,
is.
as you can see, I've got no life at all. It's just
I'm sure if you start somewhere else, it'd be interesting.
Indeed. And but I think it's a fascinating point. It's talking about collaboration, because to me, cybersecurity isn't just a technical issue. It's a risk issue, as you mentioned. It's a communications issue. It's a training issue. It's a belief issue. There's so many people need to be involved in this.
Yeah.
It's been fantastic, Kane, to hear your experience. So thank you very much. I think that's probably brings it all nicely to a conclusion.
Super. No worries.
Thank you very much, Kane.